for nearly 4 decades. Iran built its defense around a single assumption that no adversary could ever see the whole picture at once. Missile batteries scattered across mountain ranges, command centers buried beneath cities, radar networks layered to overlap, to confuse, to survive. This was not accidental architecture, it was doctrine, refined through sanctions, isolation, and the hard lesson that Iran could never match Western air power directly, so it would make itself impossible to fully map. And yet, in a matter of hours, 90 targets were struck, not scattered over weeks, not degraded gradually through a slow campaign of attrition, struck in a single coordinated window. As if the map Iran had spent decades trying to keep hidden was already sitting on someone else's desk. That contrast is the paradox this story begins with. A nation that invested billions in unpredictability was struck with a precision that looks, from the outside, almost effortless. Which raises a question far more unsettling than the strike itself. Was this a failure of Iranian systems in the moment, or proof that those systems had already been understood, charted, and neutralized long before the first missile ever left its launcher? Because if it's the second explanation, then the real event didn't happen in those hours at all. It happened years earlier. Quietly, unnoticed, the rubble is not really the story here. The story is what the rubble reveals about the distance between what Iran believed it had and what it actually still had, the moment it mattered most. But the real question isn't how America did this. It's how long Iran's weakness had existed before anyone found out. To understand that, we first need to establish exactly what happened and who was involved. Strip away the noise, and the confirmed picture is narrower than the headlines suggest, but no less significant. Reports describe a strike campaign that struck approximately 90 sites across Iran within a compressed window of hours, rather than the days or weeks such campaigns have historically taken. The reported targets span military and defense-related infrastructure, though the precise composition, how many were air defense installations versus command facilities versus missile-related sites, remains only partially detailed in open reporting. What is consistent across accounts is the time frame. This was not a rolling campaign. It was concentrated, synchronized, and fast. On the American side, officials have characterized the operation as a decisive response to an escalating threat, framing it in terms of necessity and precision rather than open-ended conflict. Iranian officials, in turn, have publicly downplayed the scope of the damage while privately, according to regional analysts, treating the episode as a serious blow to be assessed rather than dismissed. Beyond Washington and Tehran, the operation did not go unnoticed by anyone with a stake in the region's balance of power. Israeli defense planners, who have spent years studying Iranian air defense architecture, are almost certainly reassessing their own assumptions about what a future confrontation might look like. Gulf states, long wary of being caught in the crossfire of any U.S. Iran escalation, are quietly recalculating their own exposure and their own defensive gaps. It's worth being precise about what we actually know versus what remains inference. The scale and time frame are reasonably well established. The specific mechanisms, how targeting was achieved with this level of coordination, are not publicly confirmed. And any explanation of that gap moves from reporting into analysis. What most people miss is that the speed of this operation matters as much as its scale. A campaign that fast doesn't just suggest capability, it suggests preparation. To understand why Iran's defenses gave way this quickly, we need to look at how those defenses were built in the first place. To understand why this operation matters, it helps to understand what Iran was actually trying to build over the last 4 decades, because it was never trying to build an air force capable of matching the United States or Israel in open combat. That contest was never winnable, and Iranian planners knew it. So instead, they built something different, a doctrine of complication rather than confrontation. The logic was straightforward. If you cannot outfly or outfight a superior air force, you make yourself difficult to find, difficult to finish, and expensive to fully dismantle. Missile batteries were dispersed across mountainous terrain rather than concentrated in obvious clusters. Command infrastructure was pushed underground, into hardened facilities designed to survive strikes that couldn't reach them directly. Air defense systems were layered. Older Soviet-era platforms supplemented over time by domestically produced systems and where sanctions allowed, imported technology, creating overlapping coverage that any single strike package would struggle to fully penetrate. Alongside this, Iran cultivated an entirely separate layer of deterrence, proxy networks across the region, giving Tehran the ability to respond to pressure without exposing its own territory directly. This wasn't improvisation. It was a coherent strategic answer to a structural weakness. A way of ensuring that any adversary contemplating a strike would have to weigh not just the immediate target, but the wider web of consequences. For years, this approach appeared to work. Previous confrontations, including targeted strikes and periods of heightened tension, tended to be limited in scope, hitting isolated facilities rather than dozens of sites simultaneously. Sanctions undeniably slowed Iran's ability to modernize its air defenses with cutting-edge technology, forcing reliance on aging platforms and indigenous workarounds. But even with that constraint, the dispersal and hardening doctrine seemed to hold. Analysts who studied Iran's posture generally concluded that a full spectrum, large-scale strike would be costly, complicated, and unlikely to achieve rapid, comprehensive results. That assumption shaped assessments across the region for years. It is part of why so many observers were caught off guard by the scale of what came next, because the entire doctrine was built around surviving isolated shocks, not a coordinated strike against dozens of targets at once. But here's the deeper issue. A doctrine built to survive one or two strikes was never designed for what came next. Dispersal only protects you if an adversary has to search for each target individually. Hardening only protects you if the strike arrives with imperfect knowledge of where to aim. With that foundation in place, the scale of this operation reveals something the old doctrine never accounted for. And that's where the real story begins. So, what actually broke down? The honest answer is that no single factor fully explains a result this dramatic, but several long-discussed vulnerabilities help account for it, and together they paint a picture more troubling than any one weakness on its own. Start with equipment. Years of sanctions didn't just slow Iran's access to cutting-edge air defense technology. They froze large portions of its arsenal in place. Systems that were credible decades ago aged in service, patched and upgraded domestically where possible, but never fully replaced with anything matching the sensor fusion, radar resolution, or reaction speed of modern integrated defense networks. A missile battery from an earlier era can still destroy an aircraft. What it often cannot do is detect, track, and respond within a battle space saturated by precision-guided munitions arriving from multiple directions at once. That points to a second, more structural problem: integration. Dispersal only works as a strategy if the dispersed pieces can still communicate, coordinate, and reinforce one another under pressure. If Iran's network of radar stations, batteries, and command nodes wasn't as seamlessly linked as its doctrine assumed, then a strike hitting many sites simultaneously wouldn't be fighting 980 separate defenses. It would be exploiting 980 separate gaps that never functioned as one system in the first place. But equipment and integration only explain part of the story. The harder question is how an adversary managed to strike this many dispersed, hardened sites within hours, rather than the days or weeks such a campaign would typically require. That kind of synchronized precision doesn't emerge overnight. It requires sustained intelligence collection. Years of satellite observation, signals intelligence, and target list refinement quietly accumulated long before a single missile was launched. This is the detail that reframes everything. If the operation depended on years of accumulated targeting knowledge, then the vulnerability being discussed wasn't created in those few hours. It was already there, sitting quietly inside Iran's defensive architecture, known to at least one adversary, for far longer than anyone in Tehran likely realized. The strike didn't create the weakness. It simply revealed one that had existed, unnoticed or unacknowledged, for years. That distinction matters enormously because it changes who the real audience for this event actually is. A newly created weakness is primarily a military problem, something to patch, replace, or reinforce. A newly revealed weakness is a credibility problem, and credibility is the one currency Iran's entire regional strategy depends on. For decades, Iran's proxy network, from militias to allied political movements across the region, operated on a simple, unspoken premise that Tehran possessed enough underlying strength to make confronting it costly, even indirectly. That perception didn't require Iran to win a direct war. It only required the credible threat that it could inflict serious costs if pushed. A demonstrated inability to defend dozens of its own sites within a single operation quietly undermines that premise, regardless of what Iranian officials say publicly. The same logic extends outward to anyone assessing Iran as a strategic actor, regional rivals, global arms markets, and other adversaries who calibrate their own deterrence based partly on how capable Iran actually is, not how capable it claims to be. Once a gap this significant becomes visible, it cannot be quietly walked back through statements or symbolic shows of force. Perception, once corrected by demonstrated reality, is difficult to fully restore. This is the real contrast at the heart of the story. Decades of investment in deterrence, dispersal, and hardened infrastructure, measured against a matter of hours in which the actual state of that deterrence was laid bare for anyone paying attention. The gap between what Iran wanted the world to believe and what the world was just shown is now part of the public record, whether Tehran acknowledges it or not. This is where everything changes. Because once a weakness like this is exposed publicly, it can never be quietly repaired. And the consequences of that exposure don't stop with Iran's military. They extend across the entire region. Once a weakness of this scale becomes visible, it doesn't stay contained to the battlefield where it was exposed. It ripples outward, reshaping calculations in places that never fired a shot. Start with Iran's proxy network, the militias, allied factions, and political movements across the region that have long treated Tehran as a strategic backstop. Their leverage was never purely local. It rested, in part, on the assumption that behind them stood a patron capable of absorbing pressure and imposing real costs on anyone who pushed too hard. That assumption is now harder to sustain. Proxy commanders don't need a formal admission from Tehran to recalculate. They only need to watch what happened and ask themselves what it implies about the strength actually standing behind them. Some may double down on independence from Iranian direction. Others may quietly hedge, exploring alternative patrons or a lower risk posture. Either way, the network's internal calculus has shifted. Gulf states are running a parallel recalculation, though from a different starting point, for years. Their security planning had to account for an Iran capable of inflicting serious costs in any regional confrontation, a factor that shaped everything from military spending to diplomatic posture toward Tehran. A demonstrated gap in Iranian defenses doesn't eliminate that caution, but it does soften it, potentially opening space for Gulf capitals to negotiate from a firmer position, recalibrate their own defense partnerships, or reassess how much deterrence they still need to purchase against a threat that may be less formidable than previously assumed. The economic dimension moves just as quickly, if less visibly. Energy markets are exquisitely sensitive to perceived shifts in regional power balance, and traders don't wait for official assessments. They price in probability. A weakened Iranian deterrent can be read two ways: as stabilizing, if it reduces the odds of Iranian-initiated disruption to shipping and energy infrastructure, or as destabilizing, if it raises the odds of a cornered Tehran acting unpredictably to reassert relevance. Both readings tend to increase volatility, at least in the short term, as markets search for clarity that doesn't yet exist. But that isn't the most important development. The real shift may be happening inside Tehran itself, far from any battlefield. Iranian leadership now faces a problem that has nothing to do with missiles or radar coverage, a credibility problem, playing out in front of its own population, its own military establishment, and the hardline factions whose support underpins the government's stability. Explaining away a strike of this scale without appearing weak is a delicate political exercise. Every option carries risk. Downplaying the damage risks appearing dishonest if the scale becomes undeniable. Acknowledging it risks appearing vulnerable at a moment when strength is the currency the regime depends on most. That internal pressure may ultimately shape Iran's next move more than any external threat does. A leadership that feels its credibility eroding domestically often behaves differently than one calculating purely external deterrence. With this weakness now exposed to the world, the critical question becomes what Iran actually does in response. None of these paths are guaranteed, and they aren't mutually exclusive. Iran may pursue several at once, in different proportions, but laid out separately. Each scenario reveals a distinct strategic logic, with its own risks and its own consequences for the region. The first is the most conventional response: accelerated defense modernization. Having watched its dispersal and hardening doctrine fail to prevent this scale of exposure, Iranian planners have an obvious incentive to close the gap, upgrading integrated air defense networks, improving radar coverage, and seeking more advanced systems from remaining strategic partners willing to supply them. The challenge is that this path is slow and expensive, constrained by the same sanctions environment that produced the vulnerability in the first place. Modernization on this scale is measured in years, not months, which means Iran would need to manage its exposure through other means in the meantime. That leads to the second, faster option: leaning further into asymmetric and proxy strategy. If conventional defense cannot be quickly repaired, Iran may instead double down on the tools that don't rely on matching an adversary's air power directly. Expanding proxy activity, emphasizing missile and drone stockpiles that are harder to fully neutralize, and signaling that any future confrontation carries costs beyond the battlefield where the original strike occurred. This path is cheaper and faster to implement. But it also carries escalation risk, since it depends on demonstrating resolve through actions that could themselves trigger further conflict. A third scenario unfolds internally rather than militarily. The credibility pressure discussed earlier doesn't disappear on its own. It has to go somewhere. That could mean hardened rhetoric from Iranian leadership, aimed at reassuring domestic audiences and hardline factions that the state remains strong and defiant. In more severe cases, sustained internal pressure can accelerate shifts in leadership or internal power structures, particularly if hardline factions conclude that the current approach has failed to protect the country. This path is harder to predict from outside, since it depends heavily on internal political dynamics that rarely surface in public reporting until they've already progressed. The fourth scenario involves actors outside Iran altogether, regional rivals and neighboring states. Having watched this exposure unfold, may see an opening to renegotiate their own security arrangements, seeking firmer guarantees from external partners, adjusting defense spending, or recalibrating diplomatic posture toward Tehran now that its deterrent value appears diminished. This is less about what Iran does next and more about how quickly others move to capitalize on the shift in perceived balance. What determines which of these paths dominates isn't a single variable, but a combination: how much external support Iran can still secure despite sanctions, how much internal political pressure the leadership can absorb, and how proxy actors and regional rivals choose to respond in the coming months. These variables will interact, often unpredictably, which is why any single confident prediction should be treated with caution. Each path carries a different risk, and the one Iran chooses will define the region's balance of power for years, whatever direction Iran takes. One fact is now unavoidable: the perception of its strength has permanently changed. Return, for a moment, to where this story began, a nation that spent decades building a defense doctrine designed to survive exactly this kind of moment. And yet, within hours, 90 targets fell. That paradox hasn't been resolved so much as reframed. This was never really a story about a single night's destruction. It was a story about revelation, about a gap between what Iran believed it had and what it actually still possessed. A gap that had almost certainly existed for years before anyone outside a small circle of planners fully understood its size. That distinction changes how this moment should be remembered. Strikes end. Damage gets assessed, rebuilt, or replaced. But the perception this event created doesn't reset on the same timeline. Proxies recalculate, rivals renegotiate, markets reprice risk. And inside Iran itself, a leadership now has to manage the far harder task of rebuilding credibility rather than infrastructure. A process that depends less on missiles and radar than on time, consistency, and choices that haven't been made yet. What makes this a turning point isn't simply that Iran was struck, it's that the region's entire framework for assessing deterrence, who is actually strong, and who only appeared that way, has shifted, whether anyone involved is ready to admit it or not. The strikes lasted only hours, but the question of whether Iran can ever fully rebuild what was exposed may last for years.